Hello, this video is about female genital mutilation, what it is, and how it is supported and advocated in Islamic doctrine. Female genital mutilation is a brutal practice with grave consequences, and it is a huge problem in the world. CSPII have recently published a report which finds that about 300 million girls and women have been subjected to it. That is 1 in every 13. And whilst female genital mutilation is mostly practiced in Islamic countries, it is increasingly present in non-Islamic countries too. Now, you can help protect girls and women by watching this video, by reading our reports, and most of all, by sharing what you have learned. You will find links to our reports in the description. Hello, and welcome to this presentation on female genital mutilation in Islamic doctrine. My name is Julian Flynn, and I am a researcher at the Center for the Study of Political Islam International, CSPII for short. CSPII is an independent non-profit research and education organization inspired by the work of its president, Dr. Bill Warner, who uses scientific method to analyze and understand Islamic doctrine, specifically its effect on non-Muslims and non-Islamic societies. We are interested in politics, not religion, ideas, not people, facts, not opinions. We study the core texts of Islam. We use statistical methods to analyze these texts, and we have reproducible results. The focus of my research is female genital mutilation, and I am particularly interested in its origins, its functions, and its place in Islamic doctrine. In this talk, I will present all the references to FGM in the 3 foundational texts of Islam: the Koran, the Hadiths, and the Sira, what we at CSPII refer to as the trilogy. But before we do that, let's first go over some essential background about female genital mutilation and about Islamic doctrine. So, what is female genital mutilation? The World Health Organization defines female genital mutilation as comprising all procedures that involve partial or total removal of the external female genitalia or other injury to the female genital organs for non-medical reasons. It's nearly always done to prepubescent girls, and most girls are cut before the age of 5, and sometimes as young as newborns. It's usually performed by traditional practitioners who inherit the job, the trade from their parents, who use sharp objects such as knives, razor blades, broken glass. These are rarely sterile or sterilized, and nor is the environment, which is usually the child's home. There's also evidence of an increase in the performance of FGM by medical personnel. This is generally in large cities and in wealthier countries. Anesthetics, these are generally not used even when available. Now we can ask, why is FGM done? Why does it exist? So most FGM, especially that done under the influence of Islamic doctrine, is very much functional, and it's more like a visit to the dentist to have a tooth pulled than a ritual ceremony or a rite of passage. We can look at the reasons given by those who practice FGM, and the ones I'm going to share with you, I've listed them in alphabetical order, not in order of importance. So some will say that they do it for aesthetic reasons, believing that the cut vulva is more beautiful than the uncut vulva, to enhance fertility because of folk beliefs. For example, it's believed in parts of Sudan that the clitoris, if left uncut, will grow to the length of the neck of a goose, to increase a husband's sexual pleasure, to make girls eligible for marriage, to moderate women's sexuality, which is often considered as being excessive in countries which practice, or in communities which practice FGM, to promote hygiene for the purposes of purification as a religious requirement, as a rite of passage and as an adherence or loyalty to a tradition. We can also talk about structural reasons why FGM exists. Now, this is a subject for a whole lecture, but I'll try to put it at its simplest. So FGM is a solution to problems created by polygynous marriage and kinship systems. Polygyny creates societies with extreme levels of anxiety about the chastity and the sexual reputation of marriageable females. And practices, institutions, and attitudes evolve which address this anxiety. Examples of these practices are veiling, gender segregation, honor violence, sequestration, such as harems, child marriage, arranged marriage, cousin marriage, foot binding, chaperoning, and, of course, FGM. So, what happens to a girl when she undergoes FGM? So how much FGM is there? UNICEF in March 2024 published a new estimate of 230 million girls and women alive today who have undergone some form of FGM. Unfortunately, UNICEF's figure is a significant underestimate because its survey left out 2/3 of the countries where FGM is known to be practiced. CSPII, we have done our own survey using UNICEF's data, but adding to it as many as possible of the countries that UNICEF omitted. And our estimate comes to between 291 and 304 million girls and women alive today who have undergone FGM. So what does this 291 to 304 million statistic mean? It means that 1 in 13 girls and women alive today have undergone FGM. With CSPII statistics, we can calculate that 80% of the global incidence of FGM is attributable to Islamic communities, and 20% of the global incidence of FGM is attributable to non-Islamic communities. And here we have a graph showing the amount of FGM done by the Islamic community, Muslims, and how many done by non-Muslims, with non-Muslims doing 4 times more FGM than non-Muslims. And here are the global populations of female Muslims and female non-Muslims. And Muslims make up about 1/4 of the world's population. And by the way, the y-axis says population, but really it should say female population. Now let's put the two graphs together, and one can see the disproportion. 1/4 of the world's population is responsible for 80% of FGM. And here's another way of expressing these same statistics. So 24% of Muslim girls, women have undergone FGM, as opposed to about 2% of non-Muslim girls and women who have undergone FGM. So where does FGM happen? This is CSPII's map of the distribution of FGM. The darker the blue, the more FGM occurs there. And the countries with the highest rates are, let's travel from west to east. We have Guinea, Mali, Somalia, Djibouti, Oman, and Indonesia with the highest rates. And the red striped areas indicate those countries and regions where FGM is known to be practiced, but for which there is no numerical data. And this is the Western world. Again, the darker the color, the more FGM occurs there. And we have Sweden with the highest rate of 1.29% of its female population having undergone FGM. So you may have noticed from the last few slides that nearly all the high prevalence countries are Islamic. So on the left, you have a map we've just seen, and this map on the right shows the distribution of Muslim populations. And if you spend some time looking at it, you will see that all countries with medium to high rates of FGM are heavily Islamized. And immigration from these countries introduces FGM to countries hitherto free of the practice. All of which raises a question: does Islamic doctrine support FGM? Now, to answer this question, we will look at every reference to FGM in Islam's core texts. But before doing that, it will be useful to consider the nature of Islamic doctrine. So what is Islam? Islam can seem complicated and contradictory, but really it's very simple. Islam is Allah and Muhammad, or the will of Allah and the example of Muhammad. The will of Allah is found in the Koran, and the example of Muhammad is found in something called the Sunnah. The Sunnah consists of two texts, the Sirah and the Hadith. The Sirah is the biography of Muhammad told in chronological order. The Hadiths are the traditions of Muhammad, and I'll explain that in a little moment. If it's in the Quran, Sirah or Hadith, it's Islam. If it's not in there, then it's not Islam. And with Islam, you cannot pick and choose what you believe. As this verse, this Quranic verse makes clear, you have to enter into Islam completely. Okay, so let us look at the relative sizes of these three texts, the three texts that make up what we at CSPII call the trilogy. The Quran makes up 14% of the trilogy, the Sirah 26%, and the Hadith 60%. So, if you remember, the Sunnah consists of the Hadith and the Sirah. So the Sunnah altogether makes up 86%, the Sunnah being the example of Muhammad. What does this mean? It means that Islam is 86% Muhammad and only 14% Allah. And the Hadith and Sirah together contain almost every detail of Muhammad's life. So since Muhammad is so important, let's talk a little bit about him. There are 89 verses in the Quran establishing Muhammad as a perfect and eternal example for all humanity. This means that every one of those details in the Sunnah must be taken as an example to imitate and as a model of perfection. He's more than a historical figure. His example is to be followed today as much as it was in the past. And according to Islamic doctrine, he must be followed or obeyed by everyone. He cannot be criticized and he cannot be contradicted. Now, since the example and teachings of Muhammad are so important in determining Islamic doctrine, it's worth knowing something about his life and who he was. He was born in Mecca and he became a preacher there. He was not a great success, and after a dozen or so years of preaching, he converted only about 150 people. Muhammad's message was divisive and the Meccans drove him out of town. And so at the age of about 52, Muhammad migrated with his 150 followers to the town of Medina, and this migration is known as a hijrah. After the hijrah to Medina, Muhammad became a politician, a highly successful politician and military leader. And during the last 9 years of his life, he averaged an act of violent jihad every 6.5 weeks. And by means of jihad, he managed to convert the whole of the Arabian Peninsula to Islam, some 100,000 people. And after his death, Muhammad's followers continued to imitate him, imitate his example, and to spread Islam by engaging in jihad, both violent and non-violent. So, with one minor exception, all explicit references to FGM in Islamic doctrine are in the Hadiths. So it's important we understand something about them. So the Hadiths are eyewitness reports of Muhammad's speech, his actions, his personal characteristics, and his tacit approvals. Now, tacit approvals are when Muhammad witnesses someone's actions or speech or a person's characteristics and does not criticize or condemn them. Such acts and beliefs and characteristics are considered as having met with his approval and are therefore permitted. The eyewitnesses are his friends and companions and followers, and all hadiths start by identifying who was the eyewitness of the events in the hadith. And there are many tens of thousands of hadiths. These were passed on orally for a few generations, and eventually scholars started to collect them and write them down in collections and in books. So we've all played the game of Chinese whispers or telephone, where a message is whispered from one person to the next, and the final message is compared to the original one and found to be entirely different. The Islamic scholars are quite aware of the danger that some hadiths had been changed in transmission or that false hadiths had been invented. So they developed methods to determine which hadiths were trustworthy and which were fabrications. And the result is a grading system. So those hadiths that are judged to be 100% authentic are sahih. They have a strong, unbroken chain of narrators and are free from any defects or inaccuracies. There are two hadith collections which consist only of Sahih hadiths. One is called Sahih Bukhari and the other is called Sahih Muslim. Hassan describes a hadith that is very probably authentic, and Da'if describes a hadith that is probably authentic but not as much as a Hassan or a Sahih hadith. Now, Da'if hadiths can't be used for matters of law, theology, or for what is obligatory or forbidden, but they are accepted for questions of virtue, etiquette, and good manners. And there are hadiths that are probably false or fabricated, and these are called maudu. CSPII uses only Sahih hadiths for analysis. This ensures the highest level of authenticity and reliability, allowing us to provide a more precise and credible examination of Islamic doctrine and its implications. However, we will look at several da'if hadiths in this talk, but we will do so in order to clarify the definition of certain words or because they give clues concerning the place of FGM in the society Muhammad ruled over. Okay, so that's enough background. FGM in Islamic doctrine. Let's see what Islamic doctrine has to say about FGM. A good place to start is with this quotation from the website of islamicrelief.org. The statement highlighted says, "The Quran, for example, makes absolutely no mention about FGM. And the few statements falsely attributed to Prophet Muhammad supposedly okaying FGM were declared unreliable centuries ago." So this statement makes a few claims. Let's just pick them out. First of all, that the Quran has nothing to say about FGM. Secondly, the few statements attributed to Muhammad about FGM are false. And by statements, here we're talking about the hadiths, and that these statements were declared unreliable centuries ago. Okay, so this talk will give us a knowledge which will allow us to evaluate what in these statements is true, what is false, and what is misleading. So let's begin at the beginning, the Quran. Is it true that there's absolutely no mention of FGM in the Quran? Well, that certainly seems to be the currently universally held belief, certainly in the dominant narrative in academia and the mainstream media. And this idea that there's no FGM in the Quran, it's a bit like the health warning you get on cigarette packets. As soon as FGM is mentioned in any context, this statement tends to come up in, let's say, large, bright neon letters. And I've collected a few examples of these statements from various websites. It only took me half an hour's work to collect up, I don't know how many there are there, about 20 examples of websites making this claim. But is this claim true? Is there really no mention of FGM in the Quran? Well, yes, it's true, and no, it's not true. Let me explain. So, there are two Arabic words used for female genital mutilation in Islamic doctrine. There's Khitan and there's Khafad. Let's see how dictionaries define these words. So we're interested in how Khitan and Khafad were used in Muhammad's time, not how they are used or defined today. So I've only referred to dictionaries of classical Arabic. That's the Arabic of the Quran, Hadith, and Sirah, not dictionaries of modern Arabic. So this is Khitan, circumcision of a boy and of a girl, to circumcise a boy or a girl, to circumcise a boy and the maid. And let's look at some definitions of Khafad from the same dictionaries. She circumcised the girl applies only to a girl, to circumcise a girl, and he circumcised the girl, and it is like circumcision for a boy. So, khitan can be used for the cutting of both or either males and females, but khafad is used only for the cutting of females. Remember that. So, are the words khitan or khafad found in the Quran? No, they're not. So, it appears that the quote from Islamic Relief is correct to the extent that there's no explicit mention of FGM in the Quran. But that's not the end of the story. We'll look at our first hadith. So as we go through the hadiths, I will give each hadith a name, which is a brief extract from the hadith. And this one is called Characteristics of a Fitra. I heard the Prophet saying 5 practices are characteristics of a Fitra: circumcision, shaving the pubic hair, cutting the moustache short, clipping the nails, and depilating the hair of the armpits. And this hadith is from Sahih Bukhari, and therefore we know that it is 100% authentic. And the Arabic word from which we get circumcision is khitan. So here we have the hadith, which requires a practice of 5 acts, one of which is circumcision, khitan in Arabic. Now remember, khitan is defined as circumcision of the girl and of a boy. Remember that classical dictionaries define khitan as a circumcision of the boy and the girl. Now there's this word, the fitra. What does that mean? Fitra is the Islamic belief that humans have an innate predisposition towards Islamic beliefs and behavior. And for any Arabic readers or speakers amongst you here, we have the hadith and the original Arabic, and here are the words fitra and khitan highlighted in yellow and grey-blue. So we've seen that the words khitan and khafad don't appear in the Quran, but does the word fitra appear in the Quran? Yes, it does. This is a search I did at koranx.org. It appears only once in the Quran, in chapter 30, verse 30. And here is a verse in full. I'll read it out. So direct your face toward the religion, inclining to truth. Adhere to the fitra of Allah, upon which He has created all people. No change should there be in the creation of Allah. That is the correct religion, but most of the people do not know. Okay, so to recap. Quran 30:30 requires that one adheres to the fitra. The hadith from Bukhari tells us that one of the practices of the fitra is circumcision, khitan, in the original Arabic. Dictionaries of Classical Arabic define Khitan as the circumcision of a boy and of a girl. Therefore, the Quran supports FGM, albeit without explicitly referring to it. But if this were true, you'd expect this to be reflected in the pronouncements of Islamic scholars and authorities. So, here we have the scholars saying that 5 practices are characteristics of a fitra, and then going on to say Muslim jurists agreed on its legality. Some jurists have even argued that female circumcision is obligatory. I'll go through these without reading them all out, but the references to the fitra are in bold gold, and the references to the legality of FGM are highlighted with a gold background. So, I'm sure you get the point. FGM is part of the fitra, and the Quran requires that one adheres to the fitra. So the Quran does support FGM despite not mentioning it explicitly. Now, we've seen one hadith that mentions FGM. Now, let's look at the others. And we'll look first at those hadiths that use Khitan, and afterwards we'll look at those that use Khafad. When circumcised parts touch. So this is quite a long hadith. We won't read the whole thing. What concerns us are the last few lines. Aisha said, the Messenger of Allah said, when the Messenger of Allah is Muhammad, the Messenger of Allah said, when anyone sits amidst 4 parts of a woman and the circumcised parts touch each other, a bath becomes obligatory. This is from Sahih Muslim, so therefore it's a Sahih hadith. And the Arabic word from which we get circumcised is Khitan. Aisha, who speaks this hadith, was one of Muhammad's wives, and she married Muhammad when she was 6, and he consummated the marriage when she was 9. There are 2 figures of speech in this hadith. There's when anyone sits amidst 4 parts of the woman, and there's the circumcised parts touch. Both figures of speech refer to sexual intercourse. So in this hadith, Muhammad mentions FGM without criticizing or condemning it, and therefore he gives his tacit approval to it. And remember, this is a Sahih hadith, therefore, so it's completely authentic. And the word khitan is being used for both male circumcision and FGM. The next hadith, myself and Allah's Messenger did that. Aisha narrated, when the circumcised meets the circumcised, then indeed ghusl is required. Myself and Allah's Messenger did that, so we performed ghusl. And this is a Sahih hadith. And the word from which we get circumcised, the Arabic word, is khitan. And we have Aisha here, and this hadith is probably reports the same event as the previous one. Ghusl is the Arabic word for the ritual bath that was mentioned in the previous hadith. So this hadith reports Aisha and Muhammad actually having sexual intercourse together, and because both were circumcised, both had undergone khitan, having to perform the ritual bath afterwards. So this is another tacit approval, but it's much more definite and clear than the previous hadith, since this is occasioned by an actual act of sexual intercourse with the circumcised genitals of one of his wives. And also we learn that Muhammad had undergone circumcision as well. Someone to amuse them. Now, some hadiths are not about Muhammad, but about his companions, his followers in Medina. Islamic doctrine considers the example and teachings of Muhammad's companions as second only to Muhammad and Allah. So al-Qama related that when the daughters of Aisha's brother were circumcised, Aisha was asked, "Shall we call someone to amuse them?" "Yes," she replied. Adi was sent for, and he came to them. Aisha passed by the room and saw him singing and shaking his head in rapture, and he had a large head of hair. "Uff," she exclaimed, "a shaitan, get him out, get him out." So this is a Hassan hadith. The persons undergoing Khitan in this hadith are Aisha's nieces, and therefore it confirms that Khitan in classical Arabic can refer to the circumcision of girls and the circumcision of girls only. In this hadith, we also see Muhammad's closest companions, his wife, and Adi, who was a close companion, participating in FGM. So we can ask, how likely is it that Muhammad's wife and his closest friends will be practicing khitan against his wishes? A shaitan, by the way, as I'm sure you've guessed, is Arabic for a demon or devil. Honorable for women. Abu al-Mali ibn Usama's father relates that the Prophet said, circumcision is sooner for men and makruma, or honorable, for women. And this is our first daif hadith. And we have the word khitan being used for both male circumcision and female genital mutilation. So if something is sunnah, it means that Muhammad considered it as sanctioned in Islamic tradition. And in this hadith, we have Muhammad explicitly advocating FGM. So this hadith being weak, being daif, I've included it not to understand Islamic doctrine so much, but more to clarify the definition of a word, khitan. Do not cut severely. A woman used to perform circumcision in Medina. The Prophet said to her, "Do not cut severely, as that is better for a woman and more desirable for a husband." And this was compiled by Abu Dawud, and Abu Dawud considered this hadith to be daif, that is weak, but the 20th century hadith scholar Al-Albani, he graded it as sahih. So this is another hadith that confirms that khitan in classical Arabic can refer to the circumcision of girls. What else does this hadith tells us? It's a very clear tacit approval of FGM, and it also tells us that Muhammad considered some form or forms of FGM too severe. Okay, so those are the hadiths that use the word khitan. Let's just summarize those. We have two hadiths that clearly report females and only females undergoing khitan. And in three other hadiths, the word khitan is used to refer to the cutting of both the male genitals and the female genitals. So let's have a look at the hadiths that use khafad rather than khitan. Circumcise them and purify them. An old woman from Kufa, the grandmother of Ali ibn Khurab, reported that al-Muhajir said, "I was captured with some girls from Byzantium. Uthman offered us Islam, but only myself and one other girl accepted Islam. Uthman said, 'Go and circumcise them and purify them.'" So this is a daif hadith. The Arabic word from which we get circumcision is, of course, khafad. And this hadith contains a lot of clues about the place of FGM in the history of the early expansion of Islam. So despite it being daif, it's worth giving it quite a close look. So let's have a look at some of the characters in this hadith. We've got al-Muhajir, who is speaking. Means mother in Arabic. So it's clear that the person who is speaking is a woman. And the other women, the women who were captured, being Byzantines, they would have been Christians. Uthman, who gives the order, "Go and circumcise them and purify them." Uthman was Muhammad's second cousin and a very close friend of his. in fact, he married 2 of his 4 daughters. So what do we learn from this hadith? Again, we see Muhammad's closest companions and followers practicing FGM. We also learn that women who converted to Islam had to undergo FGM. Also, that Byzantines or Christians did not practice FGM, and that one of the functions of FGM is purification. Next hadith. O women of the Ansar, apply henna and circumcise, but do not exaggerate, for it is more pleasing for your women folks when they are with their husbands. And this is a da'if hadith that uses Khafad. Now, this appears to report the same event as do not cut severely. Who are the Ansar? The Ansar were those inhabitants of Medina who, according to Islamic tradition, converted to Islam and took Muhammad and his followers into their homes when he emigrated from Mecca. So we have another hadith here in which Muhammad explicitly advocates FGM, and it confirms that Muhammad considered some form or forms of FGM as excessively severe. Now, all the previous hadiths have come from hadith collections of Sunni Islam, and this is one I found in Al-Kafi, possibly the most authoritative Shia hadith collection. And I've left some words untranslated. Some women who had migrated came to the Messenger of God, that's Muhammad. One of them was a woman called Habib, who used to circumcise the Jawari. When the Messenger of God saw her, he asked her, "Oh, Habib, are you still engaged in the same trade as before?" She said, "Yes, O Messenger of God. Except it is not permissible, so you can prohibit me." He said, "No, it's halal. Come close and I will teach you." She said she approached him and he said, "Oh, Habib, if you cut, do not overdo it. Namely, do not cut everything, and ashmi, for it brightens the face and is more pleasant for the husband." So there are a few words that I didn't translate. There's jawari, that can mean girl, it can mean servant, or it can mean female slave. We have the word ashmi, whose meaning is unknown, but I suspect it means the application of herbs, such as, for example, henna, as we had in the previous hadith. And then we've got the word halal, where Muhammad says, no, it's halal. Halal means allowed or lawful. Okay, so in this hadith, we have a cutter, Habib, who was a Meccan who migrated from Mecca to Medina following Muhammad. And we have Muhammad explicitly advocating FGM. It confirms also that Muhammad considered some form or forms of FGM excessively severe. It tells us that the Meccans practiced FGM and that the companions of Muhammad practiced FGM once they'd migrated to Medina. Now, as to the grade of this hadith, Al-Albani considers it at Sahih. However, the Shia branch of Islam does not use the Sahih, Da'if, Hasan grading system. So, this hadith is interesting for many reasons, not least because it's often argued that Muhammad wanted to forbid FGM but couldn't because it was too ingrained in Arabic culture at the time. Now, this hadith suggests that this is not correct. Habib, the female circumciser, as good as invites him to forbid her. But Muhammad says it's halal and shows her how to do it. And that's hardly the act of somebody who wants to forbid FGM. Okay, so the last hadith we'll look at uses neither Khitan or Khafad. So as you can see, it's quite long. So we'll focus on the relevant passage. I'll give a little bit of context. One who circumcises other ladies. This hadith takes place 3 years after Muhammad's hijrah to Medina during the Battle of Uhud, in which Muhammad and his followers clashed with the Meccans. We've got two characters. There's Hamza, who is a companion of Muhammad, and Seba, who is a Meccan warrior. I went out with the people for the battle. When the army aligned for the fight, Seba came out and said, "Is there any Muslim to accept my challenge to a duel?" Hamza bin Abdul Muttalib came out and said, "O Seba, O Ibn Anmar, the one who circumcises other ladies, do you challenge Allah and his apostles?" So this is from Sahih Bukhari, and therefore it's 100% authentic. As to the Arabic word from which we get circumcisers, now that's a little bit complicated, and I'll explain that because it's quite interesting. But anyway, so in this hadith, we have Hamza, a companion of Muhammad, who taunts the Meccan warrior Seba about his mother, Seba's mother, who was a Meccan female circumciser. And by the way, this hadith is reproduced in the Sira and is the only mention of FGM there in the Sira. Okay, so let's look at where we get the word circumcisers from. This is the Arabic for Hamza's taunt, and this is a literal translation. "O son of Mother Anmar, she who cuts the clitoris." Now, the mistranslation probably arose because the translator didn't want to use the word clitoris in his text. So here we have the passage as it should read. Now remember, Seba was a Meccan warrior, and it was his mother who was a female circumciser. So what we learn from this hadith, we learn, or it's confirmed that the Meccans practiced some form of FGM and that this involved clitoridectomy. So remember Aisha, how one hadith tells us that she had undergone FGM and another hadith reports her participating in the cutting of her nieces. Well, Aisha was born in Mecca and lived the first 9 years of her life there. And also remember that Muhammad was Meccan too. So we have two Meccans, or at least two Meccans, who seem to consider FGM as normal, and a lot of evidence that FGM was practiced in Mecca before the Hijrah, the migration of Muhammad and his followers from Mecca to Medina. So we've looked at every mention of FGM in the Quran and the Hadith. We'll now review the conclusions that can be drawn from the references to FGM in Islamic doctrine. Now, each Hadith is represented by a one-word tag, as you can see, and I will go through each conclusion, and after each conclusion there will be a bracket containing the one-word tags of the hadiths that support that conclusion. And the Sahih hadiths will be in bold. So, summary of conclusions. Quran 30:30 indirectly advocates FGM. FGM is mentioned in several hadiths. Muhammad explicitly advocated some form of FGM. Muhammad also tacitly approved of FGM. Muhammad's native tribe, that's the Meccans, practiced FGM. FGM was normative in Medina under Muhammad. Muhammad was aware of FGM's existence, and Muhammad is nowhere recorded as forbidding or criticizing it. Muhammad's companions and followers practiced FGM. One of Muhammad's wives, Aisha, with whom he had sexual intercourse, had herself undergone FGM. No companion or follower of Muhammad is reported forbidding or condemning or criticizing FGM. Muhammad considered some form or forms of FGM excessive and advised against them. Islamic FGM has some element of purification. Women who converted to Islam underwent FGM. and Christians did not practice FGM. Okay, now to end, let's return to the quote from IslamicRelief.org that we saw earlier on in the presentation, and let's see what light is thrown upon it by the contents of the past 60 or so slides. So, the Quran makes absolutely no mention about FGM. So this is a thought-terminating cliche that stops people from even considering the possibility that FGM and Islam might be linked. Yes, it's true that the Quran does not mention FGM, but the Quran does advocate a set of practices, the Fitra, one of which is Khitan, the cutting of the male and the female genitals. Now, as to there being a few statements, a few hadiths, yes, that is true. Certainly compared to other subjects such as jihad or the veiling of women, there are relatively few hadiths that touch on FGM. Now, as to the statements about FGM being false, we have looked at all the hadiths concerning FGM, none of which have been declared false, and I know of no false hadiths concerning FGM. So false hadiths do exist, but they were generally fabricated for political purposes. They would have Muhammad, for example, praising some Islamic leader who was born centuries after Muhammad's death. There would simply no reason for anyone to fabricate hadiths about a matter of custom such as FGM. And as to the hadiths being declared unreliable, by this they presumably mean weak. And yes, some are weak, but as we've seen, there are several Sahih hadiths, and there's one Hasan hadith that supports FGM. And also remember that weak hadith is weak, it's not false. And that's two entirely different things. Weak hadiths can be good for matters of hygiene and custom and manners. Okay, well, that's everything. I thank you for your interest and attention.